You might do well to do it under a Christian instructor. I'd be happy to help you study philosophy through our study center, for instance. Or when you go to school, make sure you have a Christian or a Christian textbook that you're looking at. But you should become more familiar with these terms, with these concepts and ideas, so you can talk intelligently and you can have more confidence in what you're doing. But even if you haven't mastered the field of philosophy, you can do what I've taught you in this conference. Get the unbeliever to keep talking, and he or she will finally give you the rope with which you can hang them. And here are some of the ropes that you can hang them with. Moral absolutes, the uniformity of nature, therefore the possibility of science, the possibility of universals and laws, therefore logic and rationality, personal freedom and dignity. Learn to talk to people about these things. They are enduring problems in the history of philosophy, regardless of the school of thought that you come up against. All right, let's see if we can put this into more concrete form by looking at two illustrations of apologetics. First of all, you have listened, if you did your preparation, to a tape of a dialogue that I had with an atheist whose name was George Smith. George Smith wrote the book, Atheism, the Case Against God. And I've written down just a few things that I'd like to comment on about that tape, and if we have time this morning, I'll let you ask any questions you might have, and if we don't have time, see me after class. But I hope that you picked up on a few of these salient points in the discussion or dialogue or debate with him. First of all, the importance of definitions. If you listen to the tape, you'll hear George Smith. By the way, he does the same thing that Gordon Stein did that I debated at the University of California a few years ago. He wants to define atheism in a particularly narrow way. And you'll hear me give some resistance to that. Well, if you want to use your term that way, I'll try to use that. But you have to understand that if you define atheism in this fashion, in a sense you're begging the question. The title of George Smith's book is Atheism, the Case Against God. And then he comes on the radio program with me and he says, well, an atheist is somebody who doesn't believe that the evidence in favor of God is compelling. Whoa. Those are really quite different things, aren't they? When the atheist says, I have a case against God, what he's saying is, I have an argument, I have evidence that shows that, or leads to the conclusion that there is no God. And then he shows up for the debate and he goes, well, what I mean by that is, you haven't convinced me that there's a God. So if he's allowed to define atheism in that way, then of course he has shifted the burden of proof, hasn't he? Now he doesn't have to give a case against God. All he has to do is sit back and say, well, I'm not convinced, I'm not convinced, I'm not convinced. You haven't come up with the right argument yet. Okay, the importance of definitions. If I had another week with you, we would probably spend 2 or 3 hours just on this, and I've taken 2 or 3 minutes. I haven't done it justice. You must watch the way the unbeliever defines his or her terms. Much of a debate, much of an argument is determined by the way you lay it out, the way you set up the question, the way you conceptualize things. If atheism is rational and all that means is they haven't been convinced by the theist, then it looks like atheism can win the argument with very little work at all. But if atheism means somebody who has evidence against the existence of God, then they're going to have to do a lot more than simply try to refute the arguments we bring up. They're going to have their own evidence. They're going to have their own reasons to show that there is no God. The second thing I would have you catch onto in that discussion with George Smith is this whole notion of the relationship of faith and reason. One of the reasons that George Smith had a hard time dealing with the worldview that I was giving to him is because he had assumed all along, in fact, you find it in his book on atheism, he had assumed that faith is believing something without reason. As he puts it in his book, faith just fills in the gaps where reason falls short. Where reason can't show something, then we say we believe it on faith. And you are going to hear this over, to the point that you'll get tired of it if you're paying attention. This notion that faith and reason stand over against each other. And it doesn't help that traditional Roman Catholic apologetics assumes the same thing. Reason is one kind of thing, and faith goes beyond reason. The notion here is that everyone uses their intellectual power, their reasoning ability, and with that we can assume we can find out certain truths about human life in the universe and even that there is a God. And then we go beyond that and put faith on the foundation that reason has laid. So that faith, you see, is what goes beyond reason. So even the Roman Catholic Church teaches that. We have many evangelicals who teach that reason lays the foundation and faith is what goes beyond it and is placed on the foundation of reason. Well, I suggested to George Smith that that is a Thomistic, which is to say a perspective following Thomas Aquinas, a medieval theologian. But in the history of the Christian Church, there's a completely different tradition on this matter, which is the Augustinian tradition. It goes back to Augustine in the early days of the Christian Church. And in the Augustinian tradition, faith is not that which goes on the foundation of reason and therefore is of a different order and goes beyond it. Faith itself is the foundation for all reasoning. Whoa, boy, that changes things, doesn't it? What I wanted to suggest to him is that if you don't have faith in God, you can't reason at all. That one believes in order to understand. One doesn't first rationally understand and then says, well, now I can take the leap of faith beyond that. But rather, without this faith in God, all reasoning would fail. In principle, all reasoning would fail without that faith in God. It makes no sense. There is no worldview. There's no view of reality, knowledge, and ethics that can make sense of reasoning. And in the tape, you could hear that. I mean, he really had no answer to that. He didn't know what to do with that. And so what he said is, no, well, that can't be true because I reason and I don't have faith. And the smiles on your faces indicate that you are intelligent enough to see that he had walked right into my parlor, hadn't he? Thank you for taking the bait. Because what he was saying is, well, I guess I do know God in my heart of hearts, even though I refuse to acknowledge it. Because my challenge is, pardon me, you cannot account for your reasoning on your worldview, your atheistic worldview. And if he says, oh, but I reason anyway, and I say, exactly, because you know the God that I'm testifying to. And so you heard, if you listened to the discussion, I said, well, George, that's because we believe that in your heart of hearts you do know God. And that's why he's unhappy with you, because you don't give him the glory, and you don't openly profess him. You use what God has taught you about the world, what you know through God's revelation. You act like you're a believer, and then you turn right around and you won't profess it with your mouth. What you know in your heart, you won't say with your mouth, and that's why you're in trouble with God. That's why you're guilty before God. I hope you all caught that. And I mean, when he said, well, you've got to be wrong because I reason and I'm not a believer, what he had really done is he had just pushed right to the conclusion that I wanted all along. What did we call that yesterday? We called that self-deception. When somebody believes something and yet convinces themselves that they do not believe it. Self-deception is one of the most common things we see in the world. It's a sad thing. I wrote my doctoral dissertation on self-deception because I thought it was so important for Christian apologetics. Let me just give you an example that I used there in the doctoral dissertation. You have a mother who loves her child. Maybe she is a widow. She doesn't have anybody else in her world, no other significant other except this child. And yet her child is really a bad child. He abuses the other children on the playground, steals their lunch money, is just basically a bully.